Good,
Yeah,
good early
I'm going.
morning or afternoon, everyone. My name is Melissa Davis. I'm the director of the Colorado Media Project and vice president for Informed Communities at Gates Family Foundation. While everyone's just getting into the room, if you don't mind introducing yourself in the chat, just saying hello, where you're from, your name and where you're from, and it'll help our speakers kind of get a sense of who's in the room. Thank you all for joining, for signing up to join us today. Hi, Sue. Yay. And we'll get started in just a couple of minutes as Sam is letting a couple more people get in. All right. Well, we are going to go ahead and get started. As I said, my name's Melissa Davis. I'm the director of the Colorado Media Project, and I'm also the vice president for Informed Communities at Gates Family Foundation. We're a Denver-based, place-based foundation operating out of Denver, Colorado, serving the entire state. And we're really excited to have so many of you here today with us to learn about a project that we're really excited to have the chance to support this year. I am joined, and we'll hear from in just a minute, Linda Shapley, who is the publisher of Colorado Community Media, which is 23 different community-based newsrooms, or well, titles, I should say, publications. They produce in print and online. And we'll hear from Elizabeth Hansen Shapiro, who is the CEO of the National Trust for Local News, which is the parent company or parent owner of CCM. And we'll also hear from Tom Goujon, who is my boss at Gates Family Foundation. He is the president of the foundation. So thank you all for being here. This project that we're here to discuss today is something that is I think Corey Hutchins, who wrote about it for Neiman Labs, called it like a dog bites man story, or one of those things that you just don't expect to hear anymore, right? In 2024, buying a community press might not be the first thing you think about when you think about the transformation of local journalism and the future of community news. But it is, as you'll hear in just a few moments, print products are still really important to communities. And you'll hear more from our guests about why. So thank you all for being here. And we're going to jump in with you, Linda, first. First off, just congratulations on the printing press announcement. What's the reaction been since the news came out?
Thank you. Thank you. You know, it's funny because there is kind of like this two level response. I mean, I think there's a number of people, especially publishers, who are really excited by it. Those of us who recognize that print is still really valuable, and so they're very excited by it and what can go into the future. And I think we've heard a lot from them. You know, I thought that the reporting by Corey and Neiman was something that was just really great for us to see and hear and to kind of, you know, and see that. There's another part of people who are like, "Ooh, that's going to be tough. And what does this mean?" But you know, I think what it does is it gives us a chance to control our destiny in a way that we haven't been able to for a while. You know, we spend about 38% more on printing now than we did when I started at CCM, and it's one of the things that is really a big concern for us. And so we want to be able to like get on that runway to where we're providing great community news for our communities.
Awesome. So Elizabeth, we know this deal has been months and months in the works. When did you start thinking about acquiring a printing press?
Yeah, so well, first of all, just so delighted to be here and so excited with like the real diversity and range of folks who are coming to hear about this. So welcome. You know, so as Linda said, like we saw a 38% increase in our printing costs coming into 2022. we had a conversation with the Colorado News Conservancy Board, and Sue Dorsey, an alumni of that board, is here. We knew that those costs were kind of getting out of control. And so we were worried about like what could be a structural solution to this. We thought we had a sense that Gannett was going to close their press, but like in December of 2022, we thought that would be in 2024, 2025. So we had it on like a long-term strategic plan. And then of course, you know, as 2023 rolled out, and Gannett shared their news, we were like so surprised. And so that's really when, with the Colorado board, we were like, all right, we have to do something. This has been on our list. We can't let this kind of like slide any longer. Like we really have to take control of our own destiny. And then at the same time, just from the national trust level, as we were starting to vet acquisitions in other places, we realized that having a press was like a huge driver of cost savings, and for some newspaper groups, a huge source of revenue. So we were like, okay, we think there's a solution here. We think if we can build something, this will help set CCM on strong footing, but this could also really serve the rest of the ecosystem.
Awesome. So Tom, I remember you and I were in the car last June when we got the call from Elizabeth and about the Pueblo press closure. Talk a little bit about the roles that Gates Family Foundation and the Colorado Media Project have played. Kind of just first in getting the National Trust kind of established here in Colorado, but also the printing press in specifically, you know, why is that a fit for our funding priorities?
Hi, everyone. Yeah, you know, this in some ways is just the latest chapter in what's been kind of a evolving relationship. You know, it really goes back to, you know, when the Colorado community media, titles were, in danger of being sold to the owner of the Denver Post. And we thought if that happened, they're probably going to lay off most of those reporters, and they're probably not going to cover those communities the way they've been covered historically and have the potential to be covered going forward. And so, the owner didn't want to do that, but it was the only exit available. And so came to us and said, do you have any ideas about a different way to go and a different approach? And truth is we didn't at the moment, but we all put our heads together and went down a few dead ends and eventually found the National Trust for Local News, which was just getting launched and wasn't really quite ready yet to do something, but jumped in and made Colorado the first thing that they actually did tackle. And, so I think, we all felt good about that. It was a modestly profitable group of newspapers and had a lot of potential to evolve and get better. So we went in the newspaper business, and then, and then we learned a lot, all of us, I think, from that experience, and started to see, that it was still vulnerable and fragile. And so the printing cost and distribution cost, really became the next big challenge, as they were working on digital innovation and modernization, that was basically eating our lunch and their lunch. And so, we needed to come up with a solution. And then the closure of the Pueblo facility just compounded that. Like now there's this existential threat to everyone, not just the CCM publications, but really a whole ecosystem of publishers that have no time to go find an alternative answer, which is going to be worse and more expensive. And so everybody did, unless they went out of business, they did find a worse and more expensive answer. And so, I'm glad these guys spent the time to think about like, what's the longer term way out of this? And, the idea of acquiring a printing press and rallying people, we had to rally our colleagues locally, other foundations and funders for the initial acquisition. And we've had to rally them to invest in the potential of these outlets, make the case that hyper local news is actually just as important as national news, just serves a different need. And I think we found people willing to accept that premise that this is important, that when these papers aren't there, nobody's covering these communities and the things they cover. But the leap to a printing press is still like bringing that same collection of colleagues along for another adventure. For some of them, it was a stretch to think about actually stepping in and acquiring these titles. Printing press was not the obvious next thing. But I think with time, people realize that this is actually, as somebody said previously, about controlling your own destiny. And so I think that's what we saw. And no, print, in the long run may not be the future, but print is definitely essential right now, you know, and recognizing that most of the revenue is still tied to print publications. And so there is no way to become digital tomorrow. Like, you know, that takes time. And so I think people finally understood that and understood that buying a much more efficient, you know, printing solution, but also, you know, having alignment, like the owner of that facility being aligned with the objectives of all the publishers, like that's a chance for everybody to sort of, you know, chart their own course. It still doesn't mean it'll be easy, but I think we were able to convince our colleagues and our board that, you know, that was the right thing to do.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Tom. Elizabeth, what does it actually take to pull something like this off? I mean, it's easy to say, hey, let's buy a printing press, but like, what does it actually take to go from the idea to actually standing up an operation, which is set to open and start printing in May?
Yes, I mean, we've all learned way more about machinery and construction and permits than I think we ever anticipated getting into this. So, you know, I mean, I think as Tom said, like the first thing it took was like incredible partners, and like the Gates Family Foundation and the Colorado Media Project were really instrumental. And just like, this is not something we could have pulled off without host partners who are willing to kind of like even consider it with us. So that was, I think, ingredient number one. You know, we've also just been really lucky in our team to have some incredible newspaper veterans like Emily Nash. So we were also able to kind of immediately deploy a group of folks to say like, okay, what is the feasibility of this? Like, what would a business model look like? What does it even take to like work with a broker and buy a press? Like, what's the kind of universe of resources that we're looking at? And what assumptions would we have to make this make sense for us and for funders? Like, what's the actual business case? And, you know, that took a little bit of time to put together. And I'm grateful that the coalition of funders that Colorado Media Project brought together was also able to do their own diligence. So we kind of had our set of eyes on the business plan, but then there were others that funders brought to the table that could help us kind of like road test and refine. And that was, you know, that was about, I want to say probably like 6 months of work. And then when it actually got to operationalizing it, I would definitely, you know, pass the mic to Emily and to Linda to talk about like the actual process of, you know, what it takes to get a giant piece of machinery from Canada to a location that's ready to have it and ready to run in Denver.
Yeah, Linda, anything to add there? What have you been working on the past few months?
Oh, you know, just a few things, but no, but really, I think one of the things that became very critical early on is that we needed to have a production director who knew like what it took and what was the machinery that we needed, what were the contracts we needed to have, where we would be getting supplies and all that kind of stuff. And we were lucky to bring on Kevin Smalley, who is driving from New York, where he shut down a press and is driving and moving here. So right now, so essentially, you know, he's going to be kind of the person on the floor who, for those of you out there who have actually been in press rooms, he is like the, you know, stereotypical press room. He sounds exactly like he knows what he's talking about. And he's got all of those boxes ready to be checked and tells us what we need and why we need it. And so to have that kind of expertise come in, I think is one of the things that has been critical for this operation. And so we were very lucky to be able to bring him on at a time when he was like, well, you know, finished with this press, moving on to somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Linda, you know, we kind of talk about the months and months that this took from idea to fruition, but like I do also remember sitting with you like 2 Decembers ago and us flagging like, hey, what are going to be the big issues for you guys in 2023? And you were the ones that kind of raised your hands and said printing is an issue for everyone, not just us, but like there's a dearth of printers across the Front Range, across, you know, Western Colorado. All printers or all publishers are struggling, not just in Colorado but everywhere. So I mean, when the Pueblo Press announced it was closing, I mean, you were in this group of 80 publishers. who were scrambling. Talk a little bit about what that was like and how you and your fellow publishers, how did you navigate? And we did partner with the Press Association and Collab we had a working group, and we were already kind of studying the problem. But everyone kind of kicked into gear. But talk a little bit about just the scramble and what that was like.
Well, I mean, and that was something where, I read a tweet, I think from a reporter in at the Pueblo Chieftain that they had announced this. And so that's kind of like what started all this in motion. But for a lot of us, and I think that, a number of the other publishers that I recall, we were all printing down there. It was like 80 publications, which were some schools, some, nonprofits and that sort of thing. We were, 20, we were 24 of those publications as it kind of went through. But the fact of the matter is that it's like, I started creating spreadsheets and said, okay, reaching out to this organization, and taking bids from everybody of saying, here's what our products are, here's kind of what we need from both the printing, from a distribution, like all of those different types of what they would need to know, and then just started sending out, asking for bids. And so that's how we ended up working through and deciding, okay, here's what we're going to do. Here's how much more this will cost in this aspect. Here's how much more or less it will cost in terms of distribution. And so those were the kinds of things that really kind of helped us move forward. But yeah, that was, and I, having talked with a number of other publishers, I know that they were all kind of going through that too. And so then it became this case of where we were, sharing out, okay, well, here's the contact for these folks who have a press in Kansas. Here are the folks that have a press in that, they might be able to take something on in Rapid City, South Dakota. Here's South, and so it was that sort of thing. And people saying, hey, have you talked to these folks in gypsum? And so it was that case of like just trying to find out where the other presses were as opposed to the ones that we knew were on the Front Range.
So Linda, we've heard the term mission driven being used to describe this press. What does that actually mean? And when do you anticipate being able to kind of spread the mission and move, in addition to printing CCM's 23 titles, open the press up to others?
I think a big portion of that mission driven, it comes from the fact that, what the National Trust has entrusted Colorado Community Media to do is to make sure that we're getting the news to where, to where people need it. And that's our mission. Our mission is to be a great local community news organization. Our mission is not to make sure that everybody's making bank. And so that's the part of it where we just want to continue that mission for what we have for our newsrooms and for our business to continue on to the press, and that the press has a similar notion of saying, we understand that we have to be sustainable, but we want to be affordable. And that, in a lot of ways, helping write the ecosystem here, hopefully, for what we can do for presses, that gives that both affordability and sustainability out to the other news organizations that are in the area.
Hey, Tom, so, Linda's been talking about affordable but sustainable. This is a solution that puts CCM on the path to sustainability and also should be affordable to other printer or other publishers. So how do you consider something like this? What kind of due diligence as a funder, did we have to do to kind of get comfortable with the business plan? And what advice would you have for other funders that are looking at these types of projects that are really ambitious, but kind of untested?
Yeah, I think the first thing is just acknowledging how little we actually know about this part of the world, right? I mean, this is not a side of the business, that we have any deep expertise in or any expertise at all, really. And so, there's definitely some educating to do. I think we had some comfort that, as Elizabeth said, the quality of people that were digging into this, they were going to figure it out and they were going to get good advice. And and ultimately make a case that would presumably make some sense, but it still took time to put that all together, but Emily and others, you had a lot of really good people working on it. But as was said, some of the other funders felt like they wanted an independent view of that too. And so they brought other people to the table, which in the end, I think was a plus, because then we got to compare opinions about different aspects of this and what are the risks over here and what are the risks over there. And this isn't a riskless enterprise. Like nothing about this is riskless, right? So I think we understand that, but I also think, the risk versus the potential benefit, what this could do for the entire ecosystem. I think, foundations, I mean, I would argue like we exist to take these kind of risks. Like that's the whole point, that's why other people aren't coming to do this, and so I think this is the right way to use that kind of risk capital, but at the same time need to be smart about it. Our board asked good questions and wanted to understand all of this, and so did the other funders who came to the table. Their decision makers also needed to be assured that that we understood what we were getting into. And so and look, I don't, there'll be a surprise down the road. There'll be something none of us saw, that will still be an issue somewhere along the way. Like those things will happen. But I'm also comforted that it's easy to focus on the machinery, and I think the people side of it also is super important. Getting the right person to lead this effort and somebody we can rely on, like that expertise, isn't just everywhere. And so, I think these guys have done a really good job of bringing the right kind of talent to the table. And and again, that's comforting. I think you have to have a little bit of confidence and trust in the team of people you're working with.
And I'll just on the risk front, I'll say that I'm very grateful for the Gates Family Foundation and Colorado Media Project leading out on this. Like this is definitely not it's not for the faint of heart, and it's not a cheap endeavor. Like we're estimating it's going to cost us like $2 million to stand this all up and make it operational. And we were very lucky that we had, a source of interim financing to kind of close the last mile so we could order the press. But, like we're going to continue to have to raise resources to get this thing fully operational. But I think it really speaks to the courage of the Gates Family Foundation and the Colorado Media Project that they were able to like flip into action so quickly, and we could like get this press operational as soon as we can, and like continue to do that fundraising and really being sure that we can like build it out fully. Because, as some of like the metabolism of fundraising, particularly in the news space, can be a little slower than the metabolism of needs and crises. So I think this was a really incredible collaboration to like get it started, and then we got to just kind of keep it rolling.
Amen. Elizabeth, one more for you, and then I'm going to go to Linda for one more, and then Chris, if you want to drop I see your hand up, Chris, and we want to leave about half the time for questions. So if you want to drop your question in the chat, and then I'll call on you in a couple minutes, Chris, to ask your question. But Elizabeth, before we go to questions, how long do you think the runway is for print? Do you ever see a time when digital revenue will replace print revenue in community media in particular?
Yeah, so the National Trust, getting feedback from somewhere, maybe, there we go. So the National Trust, we now own and operate 64 newspapers across Colorado, Maine, and Georgia. And every one of those communities, because this is hyper-local community news, every one of those communities is unique. The suburbs of Denver look very different than Dublin, Georgia, look very different than Portland, Maine. So the question of like when the print and digital revenue lines can cross is really a question of like what's of service to the folks who live in those communities. For some folks, like we have some communities in Georgia, and I think many of our communities in Denver, there's a real hunger and a need for more and better digital products, which is what we're doing. And then there are like still large numbers of people who love their print product and who especially love their weekly print product. And there's rural communities across our portfolio that like just don't have good cell service, like much less broadband. And so the only way for them to figure out what's happening in their community is for a paper to, land on their front door. So like this question of like when digital crosses with print is one that we look at a community by community basis. Like we're not saying, oh, it's 5 years or it's 10 years or it's 30 years. Diversifying the revenue is so important in all places, but it really looks different depending on what community you're talking about.
Yeah, that's such a good thing that I think you guys really taught us really well, was just that these are kind of two coexisting businesses. There's the print product and there's the digital product. And one thing that we love about working with you guys so much is that you're not just, for the past year, haven't been just focused on the print product and figuring out this printing press. Oh, by the way, you've relaunched an entire new platform. You're launching newsletters. Talk a little bit about, Linda, if I can go to you to talk a little bit about the digital transformation that you've got underway at Colorado Community Media alongside this kind of print revolution.
Yeah. So, we've definitely seen a strong demand for news on multiple platforms, and that includes both online and print. I think there's no better example than last year's, the 2023 elections, which obviously there wasn't big statewide elections except for, a couple of amendments, but a lot of municipal elections. And so when people were looking for information about the Arvada, city council race, the only place they were getting that was from the Arvada Press. And so it became like, we could see how this digital thirst kind of really drove, people looking for news about like how to vote, or at least learning who their candidates were. Last spring, we piloted 3 new newsletters in Jefferson County, Highlands Ranch, and Littleton that were much more focused on like, what, one might call a narrative newsletter, where it is more about the personality of the reporter and saying, hey, in Jefferson County in particular, our reporter was new to the community. And so kind of introduced herself and said, what do I need to know? How can I, here's what I've learned. Here's how I've gone around and learned about these communities. And so we saw really robust growth, especially after we relaunched our news titles under the umbrella site. Because we know that, like, for myself, I live in Thornton, I work in Inglewood, and I play in Evergreen. And so those are 3 of our communities which you can be in. And so we wanted to make sure that we kind of gave people, as they were coming to our sites, that breadth of like, it's not just the silo of the Canyon Courier, it's also the Canyon Courier, the Northland Thornton Sentinel, the Inglewood Herald. And so those were kind of like the ways that we approached it. And then of course I can't forget to mention La Ciudad, which is our bilingual newsletter that we just launched, that is primarily serving the residents of Commerce City, but certainly language should never be a barrier to great local news. And so we know that the news that we're doing in there that's reliable is not just for Commerce City, but for many Spanish-speaking members of our community. And it's we got that from a Beyond Print grant that we got at American Press Institute, and with extra support from the Colorado Media Project. And so that's where we're continuing to move forward. And I think that, Rosanna, our editor for that, is doing an excellent job of finding the coverage that we really need for our community.
That's awesome. And I know that you guys were just featured in the American Press Institute for your digital transformation. And Sam will put that, yeah, there it is, in the chat. Thank you. We're going to go to questions now, and I'm going to go to Chris first because I saw his hand raised a few minutes ago, and I know he's got some questions for you all about once the press is operational, I think, right, Chris? Or can you come off mute and ask your question?
Yes, absolutely. Can you hear me now, Melissa?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, thank you. Yes, many questions. As many of you I know just by name, and we have not met, but El Seminario has been around since 1989. It remains under the same ownership. It is a bilingual product. My questions is we are well aware of what the print industry is and was. We worked closely with the Denver Post way back through the late 90s, I want to say. And after the JOA between the News and the Rocky Mountain News and the Post, the Post took over and we continued the relationship. So we've got a really good idea of how the presses operate. The concern we have is not to say that we would not look at another print scenario, but the world has changed considerably. And I know the expense of a press. We actually looked into it many, many times, and we just tabled it because there are so many variables, so many costs, and they're fluctuating consistently. So I'm not wanting to be a bearer of bad news in any way, shape, or form. I understand that a printed product still has to be somewhat available because we're dealing with so many generations and generations that want a tangible product. But what is that going to look like? How much is that going to cost? And as we know, print, you don't just go out and buy a few rolls. You have to buy it by the tonnage, which means hundreds of rolls. That can be an extreme cost factor we have to look at. And then the skill labor to run a press. I'm not sure what the size of press you are looking to bring in, but I would like to get more information because it is something we've set our eyes on since 2004. And we've been continuously looking at that scenario because we don't want to give up on the printed product. I think it's very important. But again, there's so many ways of how do we sustain that press. It's going to have to be something, I think, all of us that have that that hope and that desire to bring a tangible product back. I think it's valid. There's a lot of people that not only generations ahead of me, my generation, generations coming up, they want something like that. It's like the old LP albums. You know, everybody's trying to grab those off the racks now. There's
What's
something
old is
about
new
owning
again.
it.
Yeah, yeah, it goes with the whole retro thing. That's a great question, Chris. And actually, those questions were a lot of the ones that we peppered Elizabeth and her team with when we were like coming up with these questions. And I mean, Elizabeth, can you maybe refer to that? And really, one of the things that we were impressed by was just what you said about buying paper and things like that. Elizabeth, you guys are operating in 3 states now, and talk a little bit about how you're thinking about buying power and leverage and economies of scale and all some of those questions that Chris had about the size of the press and the number of people it takes to operate, and really the nitty gritty of people who really know this business.
Yeah, sure. So, we operate presses now in Maine and in Georgia. So we actually are able to negotiate bulk purchasing of paper and other supplies and equipment that, if this were just our only press, would be much harder for us to do. So particularly on the kind of procurement side, we have some economies of scale that we can take advantage of. I'd say the other thing to answer your question about size, I mean, this is a Goss community press, so this is like a small run press. So we thought for a second about like, oh, well, maybe we should just like buy the Gannett facility. And that's a facility that like you can't get parts for it anymore. It's built for an entirely different scale of demand that just doesn't exist for print products. So, the idea here is to like take advantage of some of the economies of scale we have from across our network and to really start small and then grow capacity as we have clients and as there is demand. So we're not starting up a Gannett scale press from scratch. This is very much like small run. The CCM papers are going to be half of the capacity, and then add clients as we can, because we definitely do not want to take on the risk that that Gannett took on of just really aging infrastructure that like will never be able to actually find sustainability in the current print market. So that's the answer from the very high level, and then Linda and Emily have both been deep in our sort of P&Ls for the press and procurement for this particular one, so they can talk about that.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for answering that. As I shared with Melissa, I came from another meeting, so I'm about 15 minutes late. But thank you for that information. That answers one of the big questions about what type of press. Having my knowledge behind the presses and know how they, as you mentioned, the expense and talent and skill and so forth, and where they're going to be set up at. So that answers a lot of my questions. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Great. And I'll ask this one on behalf of Shanna Goldberg, because it kind of relates to the nitty gritty of this, but have you found pressmen, or will Kevin be doing that hiring when he arrives?
Kevin will be doing that hiring when he arrives. We've got we've got the bones of a job description that we're just about to put out probably within the next week, that just kind of lays out, here's what we're looking for. One of the other benefits, as Elizabeth mentioned about, not going with like the Gannett press, is the fact that a Goss Community Press requires many fewer people to run. I mean, it still requires some, but it's not as large of an undertaking. And so that's kind of one of the benefits, but we recognize that it's a tough market to hire into. And so if you know somebody, let us know.
Good. And I'll ask you this one and then
Melissa, let me just, I just want to
Sure.
add one thing about the talent, because, as we look to expand across the country, we are learning more and more assessing print infrastructure as part of our acquisitions. And one avenue that we are pursuing is partnerships with vocational schools, because, press operation is a trade. And so like in our main operation, they've been able to get specialized visas to bring in folks like from the Caribbean islands, where there's still really strong tradition of printed press, to get folks to staff. But yeah, there's definitely other kind of grow them from your own community's way of addressing those staffing challenges.
Thank you. And one quick logistical question too. Pete Wack has asked, does the press include offset capabilities for magazine style products?
So the press will be newsprint only, so not glossy stock. I think that was one of the other questions that was being asked. Broadsheets and tabs are possible, 24-inch to 30-inch, with a 32-inch plate size that we're using right now. So that may not mean booklets, which usually is a 35-inch plate size, but it is something that we're considering. And obviously everything is still a little bit up in the air while we're getting things on the ground.
Great, thank you. So now I'm going to go to B. B, you had your hand up. You want to come off mute and ask your question?
I did, and I think she just answered my question as well, because we're a glossy publication. But my question was going to be, how were they going to determine the prices for everyone? Because we're a monthly. I know there's weeklies, there's newsprint, but I guess because we're glossy, that will eliminate us at the moment, unless there's plans to print gloss down the road.
Yeah, I mean, we've scoped out the facility so that we can add capabilities over time if that's what folks need and if the economics make sense of it. So yes, we're starting with just what we can do on this particular press with this machinery, but we could potentially expand. We would just kind of have to see, and it's really Emily and Linda who are kind of like taking all the inbound interest and trying to figure out like how could we actually structure these runs and what does that mean about pricing tiers, and really starting to figure out what the ramp up model looks like.
So
Elizabeth, so initially I was just going to ask, so how are you going to determine, the prices for everyone? I guess this could be for everyone else that if you look at their product, and then you would determine the price for the quantity and paper stock and frequency. But that was my initial question, maybe for other ones that may want to have that answered.
I can jump in on that one maybe, because that's something I've been working closely with Kevin on. And, we're still in the process of negotiating. We have a paper contract, so we know how much that will cost. We're still in the process of negotiating on things like ink and, the plates that we're going to be purchasing and all of that. And so once we have a really good understanding of all of the costs, like obviously now we know the rent costs, we've rented a facility in Denver and all of that, then we're going to be able to determine what that is. I mean, our goal here is to provide an affordable solution, but obviously we can't, determine the prices until we know what those fixed costs are going to be. So I think we're starting starting to get closer in terms of personnel and everything else to be able to figure out what our fixed costs are so that we can determine what our rates are going to be. And mission driven means affordable. And so the goal is to figure out, how to cover our costs and provide a solution for publishers out there. And so I think we're probably a matter of weeks from being able to figure out what that might look like, but there's a few other costs that we don't know yet that we need to factor into the equation.
I think one of the other things, for those of you who have those kinds of detailed questions that we don't have an answer to yet, we've created an email, printing@coloradocommunitymedia.com. And so feel free to drop, whatever your question is, whatever, if you've got like saying, hey, here are the specifications, some of those kinds of things for you to consider, then that's kind of where we can make sure that we put you on a mailing list, or that once we're doing that, we can go through and reach out to you.
Great. And yeah, I just dropped that email in the chat. If someone check my spelling and make sure that'll get to you. But that's a great way to get in touch with these guys and kind of see what they might be able to do for you. Are there any other questions that I missed before I hand it over for a couple final thoughts?
I can answer. I think Mark, you had a question in the chat about print prices in New Mexico, and your question about possibly pursuing a community press idea.
Oh, I didn't see that. Yeah.
So
yeah, I'm happy to talk about it if you want.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. So like a lot of other places, we've seen prices for printing go up substantially in the last few years. And one of the main providers of printing is independently owned newspaper in the state, one of our larger newspapers, and the Santa Fe New Mexican. And so, for them, it's very profitable. It's a growing part of their business, but they're raising rates on our small papers. And so it's not great for our ecosystem to have these smaller publishers struggling with these high prices. And so we're just trying to figure out, does it make sense for us to go down the route of a community press? Should we try to talk to the New Mexican about this? They have a new publisher. He seems very defensive about it because, he doesn't want us to do anything to hurt their business. So, which is understandable, but so it's kind of a touchy spot we're in.
Yeah, that sounds familiar. I mean, all of us here know that the cost of all these raw materials and labor is just sort of going up. So there's definitely, I think, a layer to this that is just like everything is getting more expensive. I think the other factor for you all to consider, and this is something we are thinking about in our other states, is like, what's the concentration of what demand for commercial printing might be? So in a state like New Mexico, which is like pretty rural and has lots of, papers spread out and actually has had a lot of contraction in the papers, I think you would have to really do some diligence around like what you think a reasonable set of what reasonable demand would actually look like, because a Goss Community Press could be a right fit if it's like, yes, we still have demand and we could meet it with like one press and like one shift or 1.5 shift. But it could also be that even if you started a smaller press, there wouldn't be enough clients to actually make it work. So that's the kind of challenge of this solution too, is like, it really does depend on where you place these and like who the potential, what the ecosystem looks like, and kind of what's the potential sustainable business that you could build, given that all these inputs are going up in cost.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, at one point I was even trying to think of, I'm sure you all thought about this too, like, is there a lower cost way to do this in like regional areas where you could have with all the different new technology, you'd think there is a way to print in new digital ways that, aren't like a big printing press, like, is there a smaller, lightweight
Yes, you
solution
can.
that would work,
Yeah. Yeah, and we ran through some of those options and looking at like what some solutions for, for us might be. There's definitely pros and cons. I'm sure Emily and Linda would be happy to chat with you.
Yeah, these are all really good questions and good to see you, Mark. One last call for any questions, and then I have one last one that I wanted to ask Elizabeth, but looks like I don't have any more. So Elizabeth, I just want to, you guys are in 3 states now. What's next for the National Trust? And Linda and Emily, if you want to follow up with that, if anything that we should be looking to CCM for here on the horizon as well.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Well, Colorado was where the trust was born. And so it's like so exciting that we can, the first innovation was buying Colorado Community Media. And I feel like the second big innovation is buying this press. So I'm very excited to, continue to work with everybody in Colorado to make this a success. I'd say across the portfolio, like we are hiring editors and reporters and pressmen and audience people. So I think I hope we're like a counter narrative to like some of the doom and gloom that we all experience around news media these days. We are definitely learning more and kind of leaning more into, as I said, some of the economies of scale that we're getting across the portfolio in terms of like printing, production, but also obviously like learnings and people and expertise. We're continuing to expand, and we definitely hear from publishers every single day in every single state. So we're, in the process of figuring out where do we go next, in addition to how do we keep investing in and growing all of the incredible newsrooms that we have currently in our network.
And Linda, what about you? What's on tap for CCM in the coming months and year?
One of the big things I think is that we're kind of gearing up for elections. And so where we're kind of seeing a lot of our focus that needs to be right now is in collaborations, which, obviously includes like the work that CoLab is doing around surveying our readership. But that's kind of where I know that I feel like I'm spending a lot of my time is just making sure that I'm hearing what our various communities need, and that making sure that we are responsive to that and that we are reflective of that. And so that's probably the biggest focus of my effort right now, is to make sure that the mission that we have in terms of providing great local news continues in every platform, regardless of where people are getting their news, that they're getting news.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Thank you for all of the effort that you've put in to date, and all the energy and expertise that you're bringing to Colorado communities. So thanks to all of our guests, Elizabeth, Linda, Tom, thank you. Thanks to everyone for joining us. If you have any other questions for Linda in particular, we encourage you to drop her an email at printing@coloradocommunitymedia.com. And join us. This has been the first in our series of Press Forward Colorado learning webinars. And so as obviously the National Trust and CCM have been our first partners to highlight, but throughout the year, we'll bring you stories from other partners and other newsrooms that are doing incredible and really wonderful things across Colorado. So thank you. Have a good Friday and have a wonderful weekend. Bye-bye.
Thanks.